All right. Hi, everyone. Give us just a moment here to make sure everything is going live and working right, and we will get started. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome in again. Again, we'll just take a moment here to let people log in and join the stream, and then we will get started. All right. Well, we'll get started here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Red Hill Rediscovered lecture, Patrick Henry in Love. My name is Cody Youngblood, and I'm the Director of Historic Preservation and Collections here at Red Hill. And I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Patrick Henry Jolly. He is a Patrick Henry scholar, first and third person interpreter of Patrick Henry here at Red Hill, and of course, a descendant of Patrick Henry. And he can certainly give you some more insight into his illustrious lineage as he talks, but we're very excited to have him here today. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to leave them in the chat wherever you are joining us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or whatnot, and we will answer them at the end. So with that, I will give it over to Patrick Jolly.
I am unmuted now. There we go. I hope. Hello, everyone. It is great to be here to talk a little bit about the personal life of Patrick Henry. I'm excited to see everybody here, and I hope that you do enjoy this presentation. And as Cody mentioned, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat there. And at the end, we'll try to answer those the best that we can. Patrick Henry in Love. It's one of the educational talks that's held throughout the year as part of Red Hill Rediscovered, that lecture series. And if you'd like to learn what programs that we have coming up in 2024, please visit us online at redhill.org for the full schedule. Now, before we get started getting into the personal life of Patrick Henry, the title of this is Patrick Henry in Love, and of course today is Valentine's Day, 2024. So I figured what better place to start than definitions of love. So let's check out what Merriam-Webster's dictionary has to say. This was accessed just the other day in 2024. A couple of the definitions that we have here: strong affection for another arising out of kinship or personal ties. To hold dear or to cherish, unselfish, loyal, benevolent. Those are things that we may not always think of when we think of Valentine's Day love, but this is really what the essence of love is all about. It's how you care for other people, and in this case, especially family members. We're going to look at another definition. This one is from Johnson's dictionary. I believe the gentleman's name was Samuel Johnson. And he put out this definition in 1799, to regard with parental tenderness. So again, we're kind of seeing a lot of ties to family as far as these definitions go. Now, when we think of Patrick Henry, we mostly recognize him as one of our nation's founding fathers, and obviously and rightfully so. But Patrick Henry was also a man with a private life, and this private life of his paralleled his public service, which obviously many of us know about. But he was a loving husband, a loving father, and this is the part of Patrick Henry's life that we're going to look at today. This is a letter that he wrote from Red Hill in 1795 to Governor Henry Lee. And he was, in this letter, he was refusing one of the many positions that had been offered to him in the 1790s. But he went on to say that the American Revolution was the grand operation which seemed to be assigned by the deity to the men of this age in our country over and above the common duties of life. He went on to say that he ever prized at a high rate the superior privilege of being one in that chosen age to which Providence entrusted its favorite work. But we're going to go back to that one part that says, assigned by the deity to the men of this age in our country, over and above the common duties of life. We have to remember that the folks that were involved in the American Revolution, not just Patrick Henry, but all the people that were involved in the American Revolution had private lives as well. They had families. Many of them would have wives and children, businesses, farms. They had other things on their minds. So I think that that's what's important to recognize in this quote, where he says that he's talking about being a part of the American Revolution over and above the common duties of life. And now we'll begin to kind of get into his private life. It was in 1954 that Patrick Henry was closing out the inventory of a store that he and his brother William had operated for only about a year. And due to a variety of reasons, and we're not going to necessarily get into that, but due to a variety of reasons, the store failed. And Patrick was left with the task of selling off the remaining inventory. And it was in this time, in the fall of 1754, that 18-year-old Patrick married 16-year-old Sarah Shelton. And the Henrys and the Sheltons knew each other. The Shelton home, called Rural Plains, was just a few miles from Studley Plantation, which is where Patrick was born, and tradition holds that that's where he grew up until his teenage years. The families lived in the same Anglican parish. They probably were acquainted through church, social events. And on a side note, Rural Plains still stands today. The original home, for the most part, still stands today. And it's open to the public. It's owned by the National Park Service, and it's over there in Hanover County. But Rural Plains is a pretty interesting house with quite a long history in the Shelton family. But as Patrick was liquidating the inventory from the store, he really had no definite plans for his future. He was formally educated, we'll say, till about the age of 15. He was educated outside of the home till he was about 10 years old. Then he was educated by his father until he was about 15. And it was at that time that he and his brother went into the business of running a local store. But he had no real definite plans. So it was providential in a sense that when he did marry Sarah, part of his dowry was a 300-acre tract of land that was known as Pine Slash, or Piney Slash, as sometimes it's referred to in old documents. This was a tract of land that was actually part of Rural Plains. So Mr. Shelton chopped off that 300-acre section and gave that to the young couple as part of their dowry. In addition to the 300 acres, the two fathers, John Henry and John Shelton, provided the young couple with about a dozen enslaved laborers to help work the land. And this is actually Patrick's first experience as an enslaver personally. Certainly he grew up in a family that used enslaved labor, but now he was out on his own, and he had about a dozen enslaved laborers that were working the property with him. So that's a little bit of the history of as they got together and as they got married. Contrary to what some people mistakenly believe, no picture exists of Patrick's wife, Sarah Shelton Henry. The picture that is sometimes associated with her is the one that you see here, and that is actually Sarah Shelton Aylett. and that's the granddaughter, one of the granddaughters of Patrick and Sarah. Sarah Aylett and her grandmother are said to resemble each other. Patrick's wife was described as a very pretty girl, medium build with dark hair, dark eyes that were characteristic of the family. And as you can see in that picture, those are the characteristics that describe both Sarah Shelton Aylett and Sarah Henry. And what's also interesting is, according to family tradition, she's also sometimes described as being fragile. And that is kind of interesting, and that could play into her later illness, quite possibly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. So we kind of have an image of what Sarah Henry looked like. And again, the picture that you see on the screen is Patrick and Sarah's granddaughter, Sarah Shelton Aylett. And now let's take a look at see what Patrick looks like. The adult Patrick was physically described as being about 6 feet tall. He had stooped shoulders, and he would rise to his full height when he was speaking, and when he got excited and was being dramatic. And you can just imagine this imposing figure when he arose to full height. But he was about 6 feet tall, stooped shoulders, weighed about 160 pounds. He was described by many as having kind of a ruddy complexion, which wasn't unusual for someone who grew up outside all the time in the sunshine. His hair was kind of auburnish, reddish brown. He was described mostly as having blue eyes, but there were times that some people would say that he had hazel eyes. So maybe it changed with his mood, but you can just imagine in the courtroom or in the legislature when he rose to that full 6 feet in height and he was speaking with such power, I'm sure his eyes would just pierce through people. His nose was kind of described as long and curved. And of course, he had an excellent set of teeth. Look at that smile on that man. Love that picture. Patrick and Sarah would be married for 21 years. Together, they would have 6 children before her untimely death in 1775. Now, when it comes to Sarah and her illness, we are going to get into this a little bit. Biographer Robert Mead says, the wife of a statesman often has to pay an even more onerous price for greatness than does her husband. I'm going to read that one more time. The wife of a statesman often has to pay an even more onerous price for greatness than does her husband. We know that Sarah suffered from some sort of mental illness. Over time, her breakdown would require medical treatment. Dr. Thomas Hind was her attending physician, and he recounts at times, through his son actually, that there were times that Sarah needed confinement in a straight dress, which is similar to what we think of as a modern straitjacket. And if you're not familiar with a straitjacket and how they work, basically they're a coat or a garment with very long sleeves, about twice as long as the arm itself. And they would be put on the patient, and their arms would be crossed across their chest, and the long arms would be wrapped behind them and buckled or tied. So the person is basically confined with their arms across their chest. And as we said, there were times where Sarah would need to be confined like that. And during the height of her illness, Sarah quite possibly would have needed around-the-clock attention, and this probably would have been performed by enslaved women that Sarah knew, that Sarah trusted. And that's very important as we kind of look more into her condition. Now, Mark Cuvion, no stranger to folks who study the life of Patrick Henry. In his book, In Sickness and in Health, The Marriage of Patrick Henry and Sarah Shelton, he suggests that 3 enslaved women, Jenny, Dinah, and Beck, may have been the women who actually cared for Sarah. They had each been with the Henry family for a long time. They had been with Sarah for most of her life. And so it's quite possible that we actually know the names of the women who cared for Patrick. Now, over time, the stories of Sarah's illness and her whole situation, especially in the later years of her life, they have really been sensationalized. Generally speaking, they're not based on facts. Stories began to circulate that she was this mad woman, wild-eyed and snarling and chained up in the basement at Scotchtown. The fact of the matter is there's a lot about her illness and her situation that we don't know. For a long time, it was suggested that the illness first appeared after the birth of Edward, who was her last child. Edward was born in 1771. But let's look at some actual facts surrounding her illness. One of the reasons, and Mark talks about this in his book, one of the reasons that Patrick purchased Scotchtown in the first place, there's actually two reasons. One reason was he got it really cheap. And if you know Patrick Henry and his spending habits, that's something that's very important. He actually got it at an estate sale. And so the price that he paid for that large house was relatively small. But one of the major reasons that he purchased it was with, quote, the fond hope of improving poor Sarah's waning health. Scotchtown was likely purchased before Edward was born. And as we mentioned, this is the largest home that was owned by Patrick Henry. And the size of the house would provide space for Sarah to be removed from the overstimulation of the small kids that were running around. Again, we don't know the details of her mental breakdown and what was actually going on, but we certainly can imagine that that small kids running around and the chaos that small kids can sometimes bring to a family could be overwhelming to her. So to avoid that sensory overload, she could be removed. And if you've ever visited Scotchtown, you'll see for yourself that it is a rather large place. It is open to the public. It's typically open on weekends. It's owned by Preservation Virginia, and it's a wonderful place to visit. Mark Cuvion in the book has a quote that I want to read here that I think really summarizes what Sarah meant to Patrick. He writes, up until mental illness robbed her of her senses, Sarah had been her husband's companion, confidant, sounding board, and comforter. She had been by his side during his early struggles as a farmer, as a storekeeper, and was there to watch over their children and home when he was away at court and attending the legislature. And then he finishes this section by saying the important role that Sarah played in her husband's career cannot be overestimated. And I just think that really summarizes her position in his life and his love for her. I think that summarizes it so perfectly. The important role that she played in her husband's career cannot be overestimated. And then once again, we're going to return to that quote that Meade said, that Robert Meade said. And I think that we can kind of put it into perspective now. The wife of a statesman often has to pay an even more onerous price for greatness than does her husband. Sarah Shelton Henry passed away in late winter of 1775. We don't know the exact date, but family tradition tells us that it was a few weeks prior to Patrick Henry's Liberty or Death speech, which took place on March 23rd of 1775. And her burial place is unknown, but don't read anything into that. It's not because of any religious superstition or anything like that. It's just simply been lost to time. And that's sad. It's sad because it would be wonderful to know where her final resting place is. Is it at Scotchtown? We don't know. Is it at Mount Brilliant, the homestead of the Henry family after they moved from Studley? We don't know. Is it at Rural Plains? We don't know. But sadly, we don't know where a lot of family members of Patrick Henry are buried. It's just one of those things that happens over time. Graves are lost, records weren't kept. Think about Patrick Henry himself. Patrick Henry died in 1799, in June of 1799. The grave the grave marker that we see today wasn't put in place for nearly 60 years after he died. We know that that's where he's buried, but his son, John Henry, didn't mark that grave for decades the way that we know it today. So again, people shouldn't read superstition into the fact that we don't know an exact date of her death or where she's buried. It was said that Sarah's death affected Patrick so deeply that he could not bear to mention her name anymore. Together, as I mentioned, they shared 21 years of marriage together, had 6 wonderful children, and as you can imagine, he had a lot on his heart. Not only on his mind, but on his heart when he gave that liberty or death speech just a few weeks later. Not only did he have the conflict between the colonies and Great Britain, but he had the loss of his dear Sally, as he would refer to her. It was about 2.5 years later, August of 1777, the American Revolution is in its 2nd year, and Governor Patrick Henry received a letter from his brother-in-law. This particular brother-in-law, is Colonel William Christian. And in this letter, Christian congratulates Patrick Henry on the approach of your matrimonial affair. So it looks like Patrick Henry is going to be tying the knot again. On October 9th of 1777, Patrick Henry was serving his 2nd of 5 terms as the governor of the state of Virginia. He had left the capital and headed home to Hanover County. And on that day, October 9th, he quietly married 20-year-old Dorothea Dandridge. Now, don't read anything scandalous into the fact that they married without public celebration. It's been suggested by biographers that he simply did not want to make the marriage of the governor during the American Revolutionary War a public spectacle. So that was why he quietly went away, married her, and then pretty much immediately returned to the capital and back to work. Like the Henrys and the Sheltons, the Henrys and the Dandridges were well acquainted. Patrick was a longtime friend of Dorothea's father, Nathaniel West Dandridge, who also lived in Hanover County. As a matter of fact, it was actually during the Christmas festivities in 1759 at the home of Nat Dandridge that Patrick Henry met 16-year-old Thomas Jefferson for the very first time. Patrick himself was 23, 24 years old, and Jefferson was 16 years old at the time, and that was where they first met. And I suppose we can kind of imagine that there was a little toddler that was running around the Christmas festivities as well. And that little toddler would be Dorothea Dandridge. The Dandridges were a very well-established family in Virginia. On her mother's side of the family, Dorothea was the granddaughter of Alexander Spotswood. That was Virginia's acting royal governor from 1710 up until 1722. Martha Dandridge was one of Nathaniel's first cousins. You might recognize that name. Martha Dandridge would eventually become Martha Washington. Now, the marriage of Dorothea Dandridge apparently broke a few hearts. The famous American naval officer, John Paul Jones, he was serving in France at the time, and he received a letter from one of his friends. And in this letter, his friend wrote, "Miss Dandridge is no more." That is, she a few months ago gave herself into the arms of Patrick Henry. So apparently, John Paul Jones, the famous John Paul Jones, kind of had a thing for Dorothea. There's another story, though, that hits a little bit closer to home. And this involves John Henry, one of the sons of Patrick Henry. And it was John's heart that was broken. John was the same age as Dorothea. And one of Patrick Henry's great-grandsons, a fellow by the name of William Spotswood Fontaine, shared this story with historian Charles Campbell. Quote, John Henry, son of Patrick, went to school with Dolly Dandridge and fell in love with her. It so happened that afterward, Patrick Henry, the father, ignorant of his son's early attachment, courted and married the same lady. When Patrick Henry learned for the first time his attachment to Miss Dandridge, now his stepmother, he was overwhelmed with grief. Close quote. So Patrick comes in and breaks the heart of his son, John Henry. And John had some other things that were going on, serving in the military. He's considered an early example, if not the first example, of somebody who suffered from PTSD during the American Revolution. He walked a battlefield after a battle and was looking around and saw the wounded soldiers, his people that he knew, dead or dying. And it was said that he was so heartbroken over the military experience that he was experiencing that he took a sword and just broke it into pieces. So then we add in 1777, Dad comes along and steals his girlfriend. So some drama in the Henry family home. But let's get back to Patrick and Dorothea. I'm going to quote right now Samuel Meredith. Now, Samuel Meredith was a longtime friend of Patrick Henry, a couple years older, but he would go on to marry one of Patrick Henry's sisters, Jane. And Samuel Meredith actually said Patrick Henry was perhaps the best husband in the world. It's said that he never took any important step without first consulting Dolly, his wife. And so I think that says a lot of the respect that he had for Dorothea, where he would always talk to her in regards to important decisions. Now, like Sarah Henry, no actual picture exists of Dorothea, so we don't know exactly what she looks like. But we do have an idea. Patrick and Dorothea's first child, her name was also Dorothea, and she would go by the nickname of Dolly, as Patrick's wife sometimes did as well. There's a painting. I'm trying to adjust my notes here. There's a painting by Sharples that was done that is said to closely resemble her mother. So from this picture, we have an idea of what Patrick's wife looked like. Now, the daughter, Dorothea, she's got the distinction of being the only child born in the governor's mansion at Williamsburg to a non-royal governor. And as I mentioned, this picture is said to closely resemble the mother, Dorothea. Let's look a little bit into his relationship with people in his family. We're going to look at a quote now that in 1779, the Virginia Assembly voted Patrick Henry as a delegate to Congress. Remember, he had served in the First and Second Continental Congress, but here he is being elected as a delegate to Congress. And we got a quote here that's just part of his response to Benjamin Harrison regarding this important appointment, and it is a very important appointment. The letter is dated October 18th of 1779. The vote of assembly appointing me as a member of Congress never reached my hands until several months after it passed. However, a tedious illness has prevented me from all attentions to business until lately. Now, it does go on to say something that's rather important. He goes on to say, and now I am circumstanced so as to make my attendance impossible. I beg you will please inform the General Assembly of this in order that another member may be chosen in my stead. I am now circumstanced so as to make my attendance impossible. Well, it's kind of interesting. Just a few months later, on January 4th of 1780, the couple would welcome their second child into the world, and that would be Sarah Butler Henry. And many historians have suggested that perhaps she is the reason that Patrick Henry chose to decline the appointment to represent Virginia in Congress. So this could be one of those examples that we have where Patrick Henry actually puts his family ahead of serving an important position like a representative in Congress. Historian Hugh Blair Grigsby would say of Henry that the cradle began to rock in his 18th year and was rocking at his death in his 63rd. Grigsby wasn't far off. Between Sarah and Dorothea, Patrick would be the father of 17 children, which would go on to produce 77 grandchildren. Sarah had 6 children. Dorothea would have 11 children. 2 of the children, and this is kind of an interesting fact, given the time that we're talking about, the 18th century and typically high mortality rates. Only 2 children would die in early childhood. Richard was about a year and a half old when he died in 1793, and Jane Robertson Henry, the baby of the bunch, she would live only 4 days. She was born and she passed away in January of 1798. John Henry, the youngest surviving child of Henry, was only 3 years old when his father passed away, and he would be the one that would grow up and inherit this portion of Red Hill. Now, keeping the definition of love in mind, we're going to step out of the life of Patrick Henry for just a moment, and we're going to go to the year of 1784. We're going to return again to Samuel Meredith. Remember, we talked about him. He was the brother-in-law and a longtime friend of Patrick Henry, a childhood friend of Patrick Henry. But he would go on to marry Jane. Samuel Meredith demonstrated love for the mother of Patrick and his sister Jane. Sarah Winston had been living at Winton. That was the home of Samuel and Jane Meredith for several years before her passing in November of 1784. Winton is up in Amherst. It's a country club and a golf course right now. The cemetery, the family cemetery, is still in place, and it's a place that if you're in the area, I would encourage you to look up and go visit. Samuel would go on to die in 1808. But when Sarah passed away, 1784, it was said that Samuel basically spent the night that she was buried out by her grave, tending to the grave, kind of building a little protective covering over it. He was deeply affected by the passing of his mother-in-law. And it was said that he expressed, quote, "When I die, lay my body here, so that for all time I may be at the feet of the deeply venerated and beloved mother of my wife." Now, all joking aside, but I'm going to be somewhat funny here, or sarcastic, I guess. How many of us feel that way? How many of us guys feel that way about our mother-in-laws? I love my mother-in-law, a wonderful, wonderful person, and a person I deeply respect. But in a time where we all have mother-in-law jokes and things like that, we got a son who spends the night by his mother-in-law's grave the day that she's put in the ground and says that, I want my body laid here at the feet of my mother-in-law. And he died, I believe it was in 1808 when he passed away. And indeed, this picture doesn't exactly show it, the relationship of the two, but Samuel Meredith is buried at the foot of the grave of Sarah Winston Henry, which is a beautiful testimony. And as I said, this all stands still today. Now, Patrick was obviously torn when it came to his professional life and leaving his family for service to the country. In a letter to his daughter, Anne Roan, and this was dated in June of 1788, I left my dear wife very unwell, and in 2 to 3 days after she was delivered of a son, she's been 2 to 3 months not so well as usual, but thank God that she has been able to write 6 days ago that she was getting better. Nothing but a sense of duty I am to owe my country at this important crisis could have dragged me from her in such a situation. Your sister Fontaine and her husband and children stay with my dear wife in my absence. So here he is writing a letter to his daughter saying that his wife has been sick. She recently had a child, and that was Alexander Spotswood Henry, the child that was born. And nothing but a sense of duty I am to owe my country at this important crisis. What was that important crisis in June of 1788? That was arguing for us to have a Bill of Rights attached to our Constitution. So Patrick is torn here as he deals with having to leave Dorothea at this time. Now, going back to Meredith's statement about Henry always consulting Dorothea when it comes to important matters, the Randolph murder trial is a great example. For those who don't know about this case, it would have gone viral today. It would have made the cover of all the tabloids and the pop culture magazines. And I'm actually surprised this story has not made it to Hollywood, because it's got murder, a scandalous affair, incest. It has all the things that I think Hollywood would love. Patrick Henry was involved as an attorney in this case, and the first account is the most circulated. Patrick is offered a sum of money, 250 guineas, to represent Richard Randolph, who, along with his sister-in-law, Nancy, were accused of murdering her unborn child to cover up the affair between the two. And Henry said he was too unwell to take the case, and then he was offered 500 guineas. The price was doubled. And it was said that Patrick took the offer to his wife. Dolly, Mrs. Randolph seems very anxious that I should appear for him. And 500 guineas is a large sum. Don't you think I could make the trip in a carriage? And Dorothea agreed. Now, the second version is interesting. Randolph asks for Patrick's assistance 3 times, each time raising the amount that he's willing to pay. Now, the evidence seemed very much stacked against the defendants, and Patrick had to convince himself of their innocence. Dorothea stepped in and said, Mr. Henry, you cannot afford to turn that down. That's a lot of money, and we have a young family to be educated. We need that money. Patrick then locked himself in his office for a couple of days, not even coming out to eat. Dorothea would slip him food through the door. And on the 3rd day, she heard music. And as she went closer to his office, she cracked the door open and she could hear him playing the violin, and she could see some of the small children dancing around, climbing on him. And it was at that moment that Dorothea realized that Patrick had made a decision and had convinced himself of their innocence. Henry took the case, and Richard and Nancy were acquitted of the baby's murder, and the baby was declared to be stillborn. Music was always a part of Patrick Henry's life. He learned how to play the fiddle and the flute. Patrick Henry's granddaughter, her great-granddaughter, Lucy Henry Lyons. She lived here at Red Hill. She said that it wasn't uncommon for Patrick to be outside in the beautiful weather, playing his fiddle and with kids and grandchildren, dancing around and enjoying the company of their grandfather playing music. 17-year-old Martha Katharina, this is one of the daughters of Patrick and Dorothea. She was married here at Red Hill in 1798, then moved with her husband over on the Virginia Eastern Shore to Fleets Bay. And it was said that Patrick took it really hard when she left home. And shortly after her departure, Patrick writes her a letter. And this is part of Martha's response, which I think is very, very touching. Again, this is Martha writing to her father. I cannot describe the pleasure my ever dear and honored father's letter gave me by the old gentleman who delivered it. I treasure it up to kiss because it came from his hands. That is so special. We got another excerpt of a letter written by Patrick to a niece. This is another girl named Dorothea. She's just a teenager at this time, and she's the daughter of Patrick's sister, Anne Christian, and her husband, William. And both William and Anne were deceased at this time in 1798 when Patrick wrote this letter. My screen went down too far. There we go. My dear Dolly, you are the youngest child of your dear departed father and mother. I am the only uncle that you have by your father and mother, and it's natural for me to be anxious for the welfare of one so dear and left at so tender an age in the wide world. I never expect to see you. The report of your beauty have reached us, but these must be accompanied by prudence and virtue, or they will be worthless. The letter goes on and is finally signed, I am your loving uncle, P. Henry. Within a year, just actually under 8 months later, loving uncle, grandfather, father, and husband was gone. His wife, several of his children, a few of his grandchildren were there with him here at Red Hill on June 6th of 1799 when he passed from this life. He had just turned 63 years old 8 days earlier. And the Virginia Gazette would go on to report the news. Mourn, Virginia, mourn. Your Henry is gone. Ye friends of liberty in every clime, drop a tear. No longer will his social feelings spread delight through his happy house. No more will his edifying example dictate to his numerous offspring the sweetness of virtue and the majesty of patriotism. And it goes on to pay quite a beautiful tribute to Patrick Henry. And it concludes, as long as our rivers flow or mountains stand, so long your excellence and worth be the theme of homage and endearment. And Virginia, bearing in mind her loss, will say to rising generations, imitate my Henry. The last will and testament of Patrick Henry, the loving husband and father, after dividing all of his earthly possessions among the family, he expressed his love for them with these words. This is all the inheritance that I can give to my dear family. The religion of Christ can give them one which will make them rich indeed. Now, as we wrap up, let's return to those definitions. Webster's definition, strong affection for another, rising out of kinship or personal ties, to hold dear or to cherish, unselfish, loyal, benevolent. Then there's Johnson's definition in 1799, to regard with parental tenderness. I think that keeping these definitions in mind, I think we have had a glimpse into Patrick Henry's love life, and I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you. Now would be the time if there are any questions. What do we have here? Let me This. To the best of our knowledge, the question is, did Patrick ever mention Sarah after she passed? To the best of our knowledge, she is not mentioned anymore by Patrick. What he did without writing it down or without any kind of witnesses, we don't know, but there's no mention of him by him that we're aware of. What was Patrick Henry like as a father? What were his relationships with his children like? Well, I think that when we saw some of these letters, he had a deep respect for his children. There's a touching letter that is attributed to Patrick. We don't know where the original document is, but it's a letter that Patrick Henry wrote to his daughter Anne when she got married. And it's full of fatherly advice about marriage, about running a household. And there seems to be, everything seems to point that he had a good relationship with his children. There don't seem to be any examples of any kind of falling out or anything like that. Not all of his children had easy lives, but he seemed to be there for them and always be an encouragement to the best of our knowledge. What do we know about how Patrick Henry's parents met? They met at Studley Plantation, which is where Patrick Henry was born. Patrick Henry's mother, Sarah Winston, had been married before she married John Henry. She was married to John Sim, and together John Sim and Sarah had one son, John Sim Jr. John Sim passed away. He became ill. He was very involved in Hanover County, and one of his jobs was a surveyor. And it's believed that during a time when he was surveying between Goochland and Hanover County, he became ill and passed away. John Henry was working at Studley at the time, and a couple years after John Sim's death, John Henry would marry the widow, Sarah Sim. Are transcripts of these letters available on Red Hill's website? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Cody can chime in on that, but these letters are documented in Henry biographies. Mark Cuvion's book was something that I referenced in the talk, and his is a great source. Patrick Henry, The Last Years by Patrick Daly is a source of some of these letters, but everything that I mentioned today, again, I don't know if they're on Red Hill's website, but they are available in Red Hill or in Patrick Henry biographies. How many of his children lived with him when he was governor? Okay, this sounds like this is almost like trying to test my knowledge here. Well, he became governor in 1776. Martha was married at the time. He had 6 children. Let's answer the question this way. At the time he was elected governor, he had 6 children. I know that Martha was married, so I'm going to say maybe 4 or 5. Are there ongoing efforts to locate Sarah's grave? I don't think it's out of the question. I don't know if there's anything active going on over at Scotchtown, which is where she passed away. So I can't fully answer that. It was said that he loved his sisters very much, and as a child growing up with 7 younger sisters, it was said that he always stuck up for them and came to their aid if they needed anything, was their advocate when they needed anything from their parents or anything like that. We believe he had a pretty good relationship with his brother, William. His stepbrother, John Sim Jr., there's a little bit more drama in that one. Towards the end of their lives, they did have a bit of a falling out. There are some instances where John Sim said that Patrick owed him money. Patrick Henry had proof that he had paid John Sim, but that wasn't good enough for Sim. Just seems to have a little bit of a falling out with his brother-in-law. But to the best of our knowledge, with his blood relatives, he had good relationships with them. All right, that appears to be all of the questions. And I appreciate you all being here. We appreciate you all being here. Cody is over here across the table. He's the one that put together the pictures and the PowerPoint presentation and that smiling picture of Patrick Henry, which I think is just the best part of this whole presentation. And so I appreciate your work, Cody. Mark Cuvion, as I mentioned, his book does a fantastic job. If people want to dive a little bit deeper into the relationship of Patrick Henry and Sarah Shelton, an excellent book, an excellent, easy to read resource that I highly recommend. But thank you all for being here today.